Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my ASI group stage overview and analysis video. And honestly, I wasn't quite sure that we were going to be making this, that we were going to be covering this tournament here on the channel, but I decided that it was important to make sure that we covered one of the bigger international tournaments of the year. It's certainly not the biggest, it's not even really top 3, but it's probably the 4th biggest international tournament of the year. And you know what? I've been wanting a tournament like this for a long time with a lot of the teams that don't make worlds from, every region around the world. Right now, it's just the Asian regions. It's just, of course, the LCK, the LPL, and the LCP, but hopefully one day we can get this to expand over to the West as well and really have ourselves a, Europa League to our Champions League kind of analogy. But, I'm excited to go over the group stage. Basically, this tournament is very weirdly structured. 8 teams qualified. It was the 5, 6, and 7 seeds from both the LCK and the LPL, and then of course the 4 and 5 seeds from the LCP that qualified for the tournament, and they got a chance to play out a group stage. Top 2 from each group ends up moving on to the playoff bracket itself, and that's going to be the Final Four, and we're going to find all of that out here in today's video. So I hope you guys are excited. I know I am. Let me know what you thought of this tournament, what you thought of the group stage down in the comment section below. Definitely a bit of, Mickey Mouse tournament vibes going on to this one, just with the way that teams are drafting, with how much effort I think is being put in. It's remote, everything like that, so you don't want to take too much stock from it, but certainly this is the most important thing that these teams will be doing for the rest of the year, so still important for them to be able to pick up wins. Curious to know what your thoughts and opinions are down below, but let's go ahead and get into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, we're going to take a look at the bracket, the Final Four, essentially, here of this tournament, because group stage will be over. This is a week-long tournament, so everything is moving quite quickly. As a reminder, just at the beginning of this video, I have been casting a lot of these games for LPL English over on the YouTube and the Twitch. You can check out the links to that in the description below. If you want to come, watch it live, go ahead and swing by, say hi in the chat, all of that fun stuff. I will, hopefully be overviewing some of the series that I actually got to cast a little bit quicker than maybe I usually do here, but I will still try and get into the nitty-gritty of every single series that got played. And that means we get to kick it off with day number 1. Essentially, the format here for the group stage is that there are, 2 groups of 4 teams each, and they tried to balance them evenly. Some of them are certainly more even than the others. Group A, the upper group, has the number 1 LCK seed and then the number 1 and 2 LPL seeds, which certainly feels, a bit broken in terms of just the way that it worked out. And then, of course, you have Group B as well, which is basically everybody else, and, we'll get into kind of talking about where the groups are at as we go throughout the day, but basically the format was 3 best of 3s every single day, leading into the top 2 teams going on to the next stage from each of the 2 groups. And so let's go ahead and kick it off, and it's going to start with Group A. It's going to start with one of the bigger matchups at this entire tournament, because it's the top seed from the LCK taking on the top seed from the LPL at this tournament. It was JD Gaming taking on Dplus KIA, and Dplus KIA is going to pick up the victory here. It's going to be a 2-0, a pretty dominant 2-0, in fact, in terms of them being able to grab this. And I can't say I'm particularly surprised, but I've been one to pedal over the past couple of years that the LCK is very top-heavy in terms of the way that they play the game. I think that's kind of been the case over the course of this year, where it really does feel like there were 4 good teams in the LCK and everybody else was just vying to try and figure things out. DK, of course, being in the Rise group for basically all of the summer split means it's kind of hard to get an idea of where exactly their power levels were at, but this was not a consistent team. That I can basically promise you. There was not a lot of consistency to come with DK. And for JDG, they were a team that did seem to figure things out at the end of the split. At the very least, we're 1 series away from making the World Championships. And so you felt pretty good about them coming into this tournament, but, the consensus very much kind of seems to be correct right now. The LCK definitely seems to be a bit better than the LPL in its current state, and I think we definitely got that proven here in the first matchup of the tournament. So let's go ahead and go over it. Player of the series for me, kind of up for debate. I think that there were, really 4 good options, all due respect to Beryl. I think it could be anyone but Beryl in this series. Beryl was fine, certainly had a couple of good plays, was over-aggressive at times, but certainly wasn't a problem, found some really nice flank angles, and, generally played a Beryl-esque series, but everybody else kind of had their own little thing that they had going for them. I'm giving it to Lucid because I thought he was the most active in terms of creating opportunities on the map. I think he really gapped Chun in terms of how this jungle matchup went, and while Lucid, I think, has made a lot of strides over the course of this year and has looked pretty good as a player, he certainly looked worse down the stretch than he did at the beginning of the year, which I think was really frustrating to me and to a lot of people, because it really felt like he was on the right trajectory, especially in winter and even at the beginning of spring, where the end of his 2024, the end of his rookie year felt so good, especially in comparison to how he started, and then he starts out 2025 looking so great. It really felt like he was just on the up and up, and he was getting better every game, and he kind of reverted to what he was in his rookie split throughout a lot of the back half of the year, and I think you're just hopeful that he can start to get a lot more of those aggressive tendencies that he was showing at the beginning of the year back out of him, because it really did feel like he lost a lot of confidence by the end of the year for this team, and if he's going to not be confident, if he's not going to be out there looking for plays, then this team is really not going to be all that good. Lucid is a huge reason why DK has had any success over the course of this year, and I think that that was very much the case in this series. I think Shiwu is the other player that you can really consider for player of the series. Xiaoshu has been solid enough for JDG, certainly a pleasant surprise, I think, for the team throughout this split, but Shiwu is absolutely the better prospect of these two. He's maybe not the laner that Xiaoshu is, but he's certainly a much better team fighter, and we saw that on the Jax, we saw that on the Mbessa. He really is just great in the back half of the game when you ask him to either team fight or split push. He's just so good at being able to understand what his late game win conditions are, and he takes full advantage of that. Only one death throughout both of these games for the top laner is always a really good sign. Showmaker pulls out the Malzahar in game number 2. You know, people were kind of calling this a troll pick, and I understand why, but honestly, the setup from the Malzahar was pretty massive in game number 2 to allow the Lucian and the Jarvan to play as aggressive as they ended up getting to play, so I'm not really mad at Showmaker. I don't think this is, we're going to see some Mickey Mouse drafts. I keep using that term for those of you who aren't as familiar with the sports world. Mickey Mouse kind of referring to the NBA bubble and just the tournament not being taken as seriously, we'll just say. I don't think this is one of the drafts in game number 2 that necessarily showcases that these teams aren't taking it as seriously. I think we will see significantly worse versions of that even in the series immediately after this. So, we'll talk about that there. But Malzahar, to me, very playable. I think certainly can fill a niche and a role on a team, even if others fill it a bit more consistently. And Showmaker made Malzahar look very strong here in game 2 with those flash ults. And then aiming, I thought, played great. I don't think he's getting enough credit for how well he played. He just completely outplayed Paze. Like, Paze was okay in this series, but he played Kalista and Jhin and never really got to take over. So aiming just was better. Overall for DK, they looked great here in the first series. They are favorites to win the entire thing, I think, by a lot of people. I'm not necessarily sure I'm there in the same vein as everybody else, but they certainly looked like they were favorites in this series. And then for JDG on the other side, they just didn't play well. Scout's gonna get dead of the series here. Ryze and Azir were bad. He missed every single Azir ult throughout all of game number 2. Remember, this was a champion that was perma-banned against JDG throughout basically all of, summer and even spring. People have not wanted Scout to play this Azir. He finally gets it here on stage, and he completely runs it down. Like, it's just not a good look for a player in Scout who I think has already ruined his reputation with a lot of people. So he is dead of the series for me. But if you wanted to give it to either of the two on the top of the map, Xiaoshu or Shun, I think both of them have earned it as well. Shun pulling out the Qiyana and the Xin Zhao, two champions that he did find a lot of success on domestically, and he got completely out-jungled, especially in that second game on the Xin Zhao where he just did not get to play the game. Xiaoshu was definitely the weaker of these two top laners, both of them kind of being hyped up as young, prove-it kind of top laners, but Xiaoshu's been playing a lot longer than Shiwu has at the tier 1 level, and unfortunately, Xiaoshu is already probably not as good as a player like Shiwu. On the other side, Paze and Zhuo were, they were exactly what you thought they would be. Unfortunately for Paze, he didn't get the chance to play a hyper carry. They put a lot of their eggs in the Scout and Shun basket, and that just did not work out. Their best player was on the back burner, and he never really got going. He made a couple of really bad positioning mistakes in game number 2 on the Jhin as well, but it very much felt like the entire team was running it around him. Even Zhuo, I don't think, was the biggest problem in this series. So for JDG, it just wasn't a good look for a team that I think really needed to showcase that they could perform at this level. Top seeds from both of the two big regions, and it did not feel like the LPL could keep up. That was already the reputation. JDG could be in a pretty rough spot going forward, and the LPL doesn't look particularly good coming out of a series like this. But for Dplus KIA on the other side, this is obviously a really nice win. Picking up one more is likely going to guarantee yourself a spot outside of the group. You really just need to make sure that you can get to 2-1, and depending on game score, you might have a 3-way tie, but really that is unlikely. DK doing a great job to pick up what is likely the most important win they can get in the group stage, and hopefully it means more for them moving forward. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and this was an LCK clash, and also, coincidentally, the first one I got to cast here of this tournament was BNK FearX taking on NS RedForce, and BNK FearX are going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They looked really good in this one. I think you kind of got exactly what you got in the regular season, and kind of from the playoffs and the play-ins from this team here, where they are just kind of better than Nongshim. There was a reason that Nongshim failed to make top 6. They failed to make the playoffs, and that's because BNK BFX actually just was a really difficult team for them to be able to get over. They match up pretty poorly overall, I would say, into BFX, and I think we saw that kind of on display. The only game that Nongshim ends up winning here is completely thrown away in draft by BFX because they draft Mbessa jungle, and I get it. Like, Griffin's played this over in the LTA South, and there's been performances of Mbessa that have looked good in the jungle, but this is not a good pick. Like, this is not something that you should be, trying to push heavily. This is the Mickey Mouse draft pick that I kind of was going towards, where it's like, how serious are you actually taking this tournament? If you are Raptor, it did not work out, but at the end of the day, he rebounds, he plays Lee Sin, he plays Vi over the back end of this series, and things end up working out. But they have a superstar, and that ends up getting them out of a lot of sticky situations here because Diablo is once again going to get player of the series. He's gotten so many of these for BFX over the course of this year. He's just a superstar as a late-game team fighter. His laning wasn't actually all that perfect in this series. Jiwoo actually did a really good job in the early game of pressuring his advantages in some of these lanes, specifically on the Ezreal in game number 2, where I thought he did a fantastic job, and obviously on the Jhin in game number 1, where that Lucian is, really taken advantage of in the early game, having to blow summoners, dying in mid lane. Overall, just a lot of really nice plays made by Jiwoo to make sure that Diablo is put on the back foot, but it didn't really matter. Diablo was the biggest threat in game 2 on the Xayah, and he was the biggest threat on the Yunara in game number 3 as well. He's just that guy. He's built different in terms of the way that he plays the game. He is a superstar as a late game carry because of his aggressive positioning, the willingness to flash forward and really try and take over games. It's just a lot of fun to watch Diablo play, and this is one of the big reasons why I'm so excited to have a tournament like this exist in the League ecosphere, because neither of these organizations have ever made an international tournament, despite being so close on multiple occasions. Nongshim, being the 5th best team in the LCK has become, commonplace, for an organization that I think has gotten so close. And Sandbox for many years was so close to being able to get themselves to a world championship, and just it never really worked out. These orgs finally get a chance to play some international league, and Diablo in particular gets a chance to get some international experience under his belt. A young player who I think has more than earned a spot to, at the very least, get a chance to play against some LPL and LCP teams on an official broadcast. So credit to Diablo and a big win here for BFX. This could be for first place in this group, likely for first place in this group. I thought Clear also played really well on the top side of the map. He can have some up and down moments. He wasn't all that great in game 1 on the Rumble, some ultimates that I think went a little wide, but the Jace was massive in game number 2. To me, he was the player of the game in that second game. I think he absolutely carried them in terms of being able to keep them stable throughout a lot of the mid game. So credit to Clear. Again, the good games are good, the bad games are bad. It just kind of is the way that it is with him as a player. Everybody else was okay. Kellen, I thought, had a good series. Lulu is broken. That's just the way that it is. I'm surprised this champion just doesn't get more play by basically everybody. Even Kellen is pulling it out and looking great. Not to say that Kellen is a bad player, just that he's not really an enchanter player, and he was pulling it out here and looking like $1 million. Vikla and Raptor, I think, had their own set of struggles. That's not all that surprising for Vikla, although some of the team fighting was okay from Vikla, but Raptor, I think, really struggled at times in this series to generate tempo in the early game. Gideon, I thought, had good pathing. Overall, Raptor's better than this kind of performance. He just didn't really get a chance to show it. Hopefully he can a little bit more throughout the rest of this tournament. But for Nongshim on the other side, this was not exactly how you wanted to kick things off, especially going up 1-0 in this series. I think they expected to be able to, maybe put up a better fight here. The slate was wiped clean. I know they lost all their momentum and all their confidence, coming off of the summer split, where basically every single thing that could go wrong went wrong, but he just wanted to see them come out here and kind of erase that, kind of, get themselves back into the mindset of being one of the better teams at this tournament and being a threat to actually win it all. And in game 1, it looked like they were going to do that. Jiwoo played great. I thought Calyx ended up playing really great. Lahens had a phenomenal game on the Nico in game number 1, but they just couldn't really carry it over to the rest of the series, where despite having damage and despite having the ability to break through BFX, they just couldn't really put it together. And Diablo was the best player on the Rift, which meant that they ended up losing the series and losing game number 3. Gideon, for me, is going to get done of the series. This Poppy is way too valuable in game number 3 to have the game that Gideon had. I think you just need to be more active. You just need to make sure that you're in a spot to be able to take advantage of Raptor's mistakes, which he was making quite a few of. When you're playing into Vi and Ari and Jax and you're Poppy in game number 3 and you're the least valuable player on the Rift, that is a personal problem. There is no way that should be acceptable. There were some positive performances. I think Jiwoo actually played really well in this series. I thought Calyx also just was the better mid laner. Not that should surprise anybody who's watched these two play over the course of this year. Lahens had a couple of nice engages, like I said, and Kingen was okay enough, certainly fine on the top side of the map. I can't really complain about his performances on Gragas and on Sion, but at the end of the day, Nongshim just didn't have the firepower. They weren't the best team because they didn't have the best player on the Rift, and that's what BFX can really rely on. That Diablo might even be the best single player at this entire tournament in terms of the form that he's currently in. hopefully he's going to be able to keep it up. He is a big reason why I look at BFX as the favorite in Group B here to be able to get out as that #1 seed to potentially go undefeated now that they've beaten Nongshim at 3-0 in the group stage. If they can do that, that's enough momentum to get them into these, best of 3, best of 5s down the stretch of this tournament and actually turn them into a potential international winning team. But then moving on to our third series of day #1, and this one was one that I think we could have expected in terms of the result. It was Weibo Gaming taking on GAM Esports, kind of both of these teams getting their, big debuts internationally here of 2025, but Weibo doing a much better job to capitalize on it than GAM did. Although, credit to GAM, they pulled out their own set of pocket picks and kind of set themselves up into a game that I think was playable. They just didn't end up being able to capitalize on it in the late game. Game 1 certainly a better draft than game #2, in my opinion, but for Weibo, I think they just executed better. There's not really a lot else to say. It didn't even really feel like they were all that locked in terms of, making sure their comms were right. It was just, okay, well, we have better hands, so let's go ahead and hands check everything that GAM is doing, and you gave TN Kiana, and obviously, he's had such a ridiculously good year on this champion, and on a lot of these carry champions, it just kind of felt like a pretty big mistake to make, and of course, TN absolutely punished them for it. He is player of the series here, mostly for that Kiana game in game #2. Still was very good on the Jarvan in game #1. I think Breathe getting player of the game in game 1 on the Scion was quite funny, in my opinion. TN, I think, more than earned it. I think Crisp had a really good game 1 on the Braum. I think Light and Xiaohu were also very good in game 1, but really, again, TN was the one to carry that second game. Just exciting to see him live up to the potential. I think, obviously, TN kind of lost a little bit of the reputation across the past couple of years, specifically across, this year, in terms of not being able to make Worlds, being a player that everybody considered one of the big 3 junglers in the LPL, and not really living up to that billing, at least in a lot of people's eyes, in 2025. But I think it's fair to say that he's been the best player on this team. I certainly feel like it's fair to say that he is the one that is the most consistent with their performances, and if Weibo was going to have a chance to go to Worlds, we were talking about it on the LPL English broadcast, it would have been because of TN. He still was able to carry them in a lot of instances, and I really just hope that people don't turn on him too much, because Weibo Gaming was kind of a disaster this year in a lot of different ways, because players like Light had career low performances because they could never really find a support that could end up playing. Xiaohu was his inconsistent self that has kind of caused a lot of backlash from the community over the past couple of years. All of that ended up playing in to why Weibo missed Worlds. Let's not take that out on TN, who I think still is a world-class jungler and can still be in a spot where he can take over a lot of games against good teams. Now, GAM is a team they should be beating. It's not really a surprise that he comes out here and just outplays Levi, because he's kind of the better player in a lot of different areas, especially as a carry, which we saw in this series, but it's just good to see that he showed up internationally here. Breathe was solid. Like I said, he ends up getting player of the game in game 1 on the Scion. I don't know how deserved that ends up being, but certainly was fun. I think he even played better in game 2 on the Rek'Sai, being able to really neutralize that top lane matchup and then basically making Artemis's life a living hell in those team fights with the Rek'Sai ultimate. Light was really good here. He was probably the second best player on the team. Lucian, Kai'Sa, the Kai'Sa in particular in game 2 was awesome. Light has had a really tough year. I think this guy has completely regressed in a lot of areas. I know a lot of people are talking because, the mental stuff behind the scenes. He didn't want to play with Crisp at the beginning of the year. He didn't even really want to play with Hong at the beginning of the year. And just all of this stuff where it's like Light is, apparently not happy with the situation here at Weibo Gaming. Whatever it is, Light had the worst year of his entire career. I think that's very fair to say. At least he showed up here on the Kai'Sa in game #2, playing with one earbud in, by the way. Wasn't even actually on comms, was literally just sitting there playing solo queue, stat checking everybody. Xiaohu was fine. Crisp was fine. Weibo Gaming is a good team, and I think they have things going for them. There is a chance that they are, the best LPL team at this tournament, that they are a threat to actually win the entire thing, because we know that Weibo Gaming can turn things around on a dime, but it's just really hard to believe in this team when they even kind of struggled in these 2 games against GAM, and they already weren't living up to their potential. For GAM, at least they played their own style. Like, you can't say they tried to adapt to the meta. They at least went out and said, hey, Levi's going to be playing Lilia and Shyvana in these 2 games, and we're going to try to win off of him being able to carry in the late game. Just didn't really work. I like the Lilia Aatrox as the B4, B5 in game #1 a lot more than I like the Shyvana in game #2, but at the end of the day, at least you were going for something here. Artemis, for me, is going to get dead of the series. The Corki, the Misfortune, his positioning is terrible. Like, he is an okay player. He has things going for him. I think his laning is actually pretty solid, and he's really not all that bad when he can dish out a ton of damage. His aggressiveness is really high, and I think that can get him a lot more kills than maybe other AD carries are going to get, but he's going to die a lot more than every other AD carry will as well, because again, his positioning is just way too aggressive. He's way too far forward basically all the time. This has always been an issue with Artemis as a player, and he's never really been able to figure it out. I think Elio also had a lot of trouble in this series. I can't reiterate enough. When you're playing Poppy and you're going into a comp of Jarvan and Lucian and all of these champions and you're not effective and you're not the strongest champion on the Rift just from an inherent kit perspective, it's really hard for me to think that you played even a remotely average game. But Artemis was getting caught a little bit too many times on the Corki, and the misfortune was kind of useless, so he ends up stealing dead of the series away from Elio. You know, Levi, I think, deserves some credit for picking champions that he's good at and actually, you know, looking okay on them, despite the fact that they weren't particularly good in the draft. Like, this is an unplayable Shyvana game as long as Weibo even tries, and Levi did a good job of getting himself back in it. Aris is, like, okay in the mid lane, certainly an upgrade from Emo in terms of how he plays the map, and KIA, you know, never really got a chance to take over. I thought the Aatrox could actually just be massive in game number 1. Didn't really end up working out that way. GAM just didn't really have the firepower to go toe-to-toe with Weibo, and that's not particularly surprising. The LCP teams are unfortunately pretty big underdogs at this tournament. You know, teams like the Flying Oysters and even Secret Whales, I think, have a lot going for them at Worlds, but these are not those teams. I think the depth of this region is maybe a little bit tougher in terms of competing with the LPL and the LCK. So credit to Weibo for picking up a win that, again, they probably should. They're, you know, pushing for first place in this group. If they can pick up some massive wins down the stretch, they could perhaps get it. Then moving on now to day number 2, and we kick day 2 off with the matchup between the 6th seed from the LCK and BNK FearX, and the debuting Ninjas in Pyjamas at this tournament, the final LPL team to debut here. And BFX once again is going to pick up another win here. They've beaten Nongshim, they've beaten Ninjas in Pyjamas. It's only Vikings left in their group, and you know what? BFX are looking pretty good to go undefeated in the group stage, and that is certainly not too shabby for them. I can't say it's unexpected because this was the anticipated outcome, I think, going into this tournament. They certainly looked like the best team in Group B, but being able to dismantle NIP so effortlessly here, I think, is really, really positive for BFX, because I think the funny thing to kind of talk about with these two teams is that BFX really is just like a better version of NIP. When you go down the line and look at their, you know, players and the positions that they're in, I think, you know, BFX, they really have a lot of similarities to Ninjas in Pyjamas, and unfortunately for NIP, they just don't have the consistency to be able to overcome it. Doingby was just not good enough in this series to really make the most of it, and that certainly is the win condition for NIP if Nio and Leave can step up alongside Doingby. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is once again going to go to Diablo. When he is the best player on the Rift, it is really hard for BFX to lose, and that is a credit to him and how good he can be when he does have resources. It's not just, oh, you know, he is a good player and they set him up really well and he can use his mechanics to win. It's he actively can just 1v9 fights if he is put in a position where he can do that. And he can do it on a variety of different champions. I mean, he played Lucian and Kalista in this series. It's not like he was playing the Yunara and the Xayah that he was previously when he was beating up on Nongshim. He got to play some early game champions here in some early game comps alongside things like, you know, Jace, Vi, Talia in game number 2, and they still were able to pick up the victory because of all of the resources that ended up going to Diablo in the early game. This guy's just ridiculous. The comparison I always gave to LPL fans when I was talking about him is he's like if Leave was way better. And I know that feels like a pretty insulting thing to Leave, but you saw that in this series where Leave wasn't trusted nearly as much to carry these games in the way that resources were allocated to him. He plays Mel bot lane in game number 2, which is still very good. I want to make it clear, I actually love this pick. I think it's been underutilized throughout this year. I think that there are plenty of circumstances where Mel bot lane is actually incredibly strong, but Diablo is just a better version of Leave, and therefore he is going to just win a lot of these laning phases, get the resources, and take over in the late game in the way that, you know, NIP can't really answer for. Clear continues to have a really good tournament. He's actually great so far through the first 2 series. Hopefully that keeps up because, again, he can be very streaky as a player. He can have those good and bad moments, but if the good moments are going to be there, awesome, man. Like, I hope we can keep that because Clear is really fun to watch when he actually gets to play from ahead. Vikla was solid here. I don't think people were expecting Vikla to go up against Doingby and actually hold his own, but he more than did that, I think, in this series. I think he was actually really good as a facilitator on the Talia. In game number 2, he opened up the map quite a bit, and while Doingby was trying his best on the Galio to make sure that things went according to plan, they just didn't really have the damage to ever really be able to break through, and he couldn't carry in game 1 on the Akali when they played that double assassin duo with the Kiana in the mid-jungle duo. So credit to Vikla. I think he did a good job of kind of shutting down a lot of the aggression that NIP would have expected to generate in that area of the map. Raptor and Kellen were also solid. Kellen is very underrated. Raptor's not having the best tournament in the entire world, but he's certainly not been a disaster. I think Diablo is good enough and Clear is stepping up to the point where BFX actually do look like one of the scariest teams here at ASI. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, Of course, not the debut that maybe they were looking for in terms of how the team ended up breaking down here. I think that there were some good things to take away from this series, but also some negatives. I think Nio was honestly pretty solid in the jungle. I think this is one of the big reasons why I compare these two teams a lot, where Raptor and Nio are kind of in a similar boat to me, where both of them are young-ish players, although Nio certainly has less experience than Raptor at this point. And both have really high upside, I think, as carry junglers, but both of them are pretty feast or famine when they have to play from behind, when they lose tempo in the early game, or if they're playing scalers. They're just not nearly as efficient as maybe you would expect them to be. And Nio, I think, kind of stepped up here today, was actually kind of proving me wrong, I think, for a bit, playing a lot of these early game champions like the Kiana and the Lee Sin. Unfortunately, just wasn't really enough. But outside of him, I don't think the rest of the team was all that good. Solo kill was fine. Clear was good on the other side. Solo kill wasn't making a ton of ridiculous mistakes on the top side for his first international tournament. I think he was doing okay. But Doingb, Leave, Niket, I think all just kind of felt outclassed by their opposition. And that includes Doingb, going into Vikla. I think he just never really felt like he was able to open things up. He was more active than Vikla, but not every single one of those plays ended up working. And I think Vikla avoiding those mistakes and Doingb not really being able to do that, I think was a big, favor for BFX, was a big point in favor of them. And then, like I said, Leave is already just kind of a worse version of Diablo in terms of the way he plays. I want to defend the Mel bot lane pick because I do think this champion is really strong, and I think she's very good in that role in particular right now, but just wasn't good enough to be able to overcome Diablo, who is probably the AD carry at this tournament, like the single best one. And then Niket's going to be dead of the series for me. The Nico, the Leona, that could never really find consistent engage angles. This would have been Leave because of his positioning in a lot of these fights, but at least Leave had a couple of really nice aggressive plays. It really didn't feel like Niket had the same thing going for him for NIP. But if you want to give it to somebody, one of those two, I think it's fair to give it to one of those two. Not really the start NIP we're looking for, but not a surprise loss here. The real question is, can NIP beat a team like Nongshim? That will likely determine whether or not they can get out of this group or not. And then for BFX, on the other side, they are in a prime position right now to get first place, to go undefeated in the group stage, and to go in with as much confidence as possible to the Final Four here at this tournament. Not all that surprising to see the Fearless Foxes actually step up when they need to, but it certainly is good to see that a lot of the trust and hope that I've been putting on this team throughout basically all of 2025 after the winter split. Do not get me wrong, I was super low on this team at the beginning of the year, but after we realized how good Diablo was, like, all the hope and trust that I put on them in the summer split is coming to fruition, not just domestically, but now internationally as well. Then moving on to our second series here of day number 2, and we get our LPL Civil War as we got the LCK one. Yesterday, it was JD Gaming taking on Weibo Gaming, and JDG is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. Once again, just taking down Weibo. They did it in the domestic playoffs. They did it in the regional qualifiers. They are doing it once again here at ASI. The problem is, this series was so sloppy, and I think if there was ever proof that I don't think the LPL is taking this tournament all that seriously, I think this was the proof that perhaps you were looking for, because they were not taking this seriously. That I can absolutely promise you. Tien was laughing after the game because he completely ran it down in game 2 on the Lee Sin. Like, that's where we're at. It just really doesn't feel like the LPL are going into this with the same kind of gravitas that maybe the LCK and even the LCP are at the current moment. But let's go ahead and talk about it. For the win for JDG, player of the series for me is going to go to Paze in the bot lane. He really is the guy for JDG when they end up winning games. That Corky in game number 1 was tough. Like, that was really difficult to overcome. You can talk about how the LPL teams aren't taking it all that seriously. It does not feel like Paze necessarily got that memo in terms of the way that he has performed so far at this tournament. I'm not saying that he's hard stuck or anything like that like everybody else is claiming. I think he is stuck on this team. He's much better than JDG. He should be at the World Championships in terms of the performance and the production that he's given over the course of this year, but I do think that this is a guy who can be rather inconsistent, as we saw in the summer split of the LPL regular season. I'm just glad that he's stepping up here when he needs to. Light has been a disaster over the course of this year. Paze has been infinitely better, and he's proven that over and over and over again when these two play against each other, both in the LPL and now here on the international stage. The other player that I think was worth shouting out as a player of the series, nominee, well, there were two. Number 1, Xiaoshu on the top side, who I think really showed a lot of that, LPL form that he brought into the end of the season, where he actually is just really good in lane. Breathe was not good in this series. And again, I think part of it is just that it's clear he's not taking it all that seriously. He wasn't really trying all that hard in lane, but Xiaoshu really gapped him in the 1v1. You look at that game number 2 on the Mbessa, he completely took over, not only in the back half, but in the laning phase against the Rumble as well. And that should not always necessarily happen. I think this is quite a bad matchup for Mbessa. So credit to Xiaoshu for actually being able to, really kind of pressure out, breathe, and be the better top laner in this series. Scout, I thought, looked great. He looked awesome on the Lissandra in game number 2. This is a champion that, again, people are talking about being like, oh, Mickey Mouse draft, like, how much are they even trying? Lissandra into LeBlanc is like the counter pick. This has always been something that everybody ends up bringing out. It's more the question of why did you blind pick Lee Sin LeBlanc on the other side of this if you're Weibo Gaming, rather than why did you answer with Lissandra? This actually makes a lot of sense in terms of how this draft ends up breaking down, and Scout really made the most of it. This was definitely better than whatever he had to show on day number 1. That is for damn sure against Showmaker and Dplus KIA. Joao and Shun were also fine. I don't think they were excellent. I don't think they were terrible. Joao was definitely better than Crisp on the other side, and Shun was better than TN, but it wasn't necessarily individual gaps. It was much more a team gap in terms of how things broke down. So for JDG, at least they can prove that they probably are the best LPL team at this tournament, for whatever that's worth, at least in its current state. This win likely gets them into a spot where they should be able to get out of the group now, as long as they, pick things up against GAM on day number 3. And for Weibo, it makes things quite tough for them because their fate is basically out of their hands at this point. They need JDG to not get that 2-win threshold, and they also need to beat Dplus KIA, which are two things that are very difficult to have happen, and it doesn't really look like they're in the form to do that at the current moment. Breathe is going to get my dud of the series. He was mega gapped by Xiaoshu on the top side of this matchup. He wasn't the only player to play bad on Weibo, but I certainly think he played the worst, and that's why dead of the series, I think, is apt. That Rumble game in game 2 was just atrocious. He wasn't very good on the Cassante in game number 1 either. It just really felt like he was outclassed by Xiaoshu on the other side of this matchup, and that is never a great place to be. I considered giving Light dead of the series because I think Pays was so much better, and Light was just not trying. It's clear that this guy is completely mentally checked out, both because he doesn't really want to be playing for Weibo anymore, and also because it's clear he doesn't really care about this tournament all that much. But, I think Breathe was worse. Just, Light would be getting it from a passion project for me. He would be my passion dud of the series, my personal dud of the series, because I'm just frustrated. He's just such a frustrating player to watch right now because he was the most consistent AD carry in the LPL for so many years, and now it just feels like he's given up mentally, and, no room for that. Like, I just have no respect for it. All due respect to Light as a player. Like, if that is the case, if all the rumors are true, and this guy has just been mentally checked out all year, okay, man, have fun on LNG next year. And then for Crisp and TM, like, they were okay. Xiaohu as well, they were fine. Crisp had a couple of big problems here. Couldn't really ever get going on the recon in game 1. TN was way too far forward in most instances, but at least he was pulling back some gold for the team. He was clearly just kind of playing for fun, and Xiaohu was doing his best, but he was in some terrible matchups throughout this series. So Weibo definitely not feeling like a team that's going to show up at this tournament. They are now sitting in a position where, best case scenario, they have to hope for some upsets in order to have even a shot of getting out of this group. But for JDG, they control their own destiny at this point as long as they can take care of GAM. They should be in a spot where they exit this group at 2-1 and make their way to the top 4. That's expected from the number 1 seed from the LPL. They likely will be the only LPL team representing the region. Depending on what happens with Ninjas and Pyjamas down in Group B, but JDG is the best LPL team at this tournament, or at least that's how they look right now. Then moving on to our third series of day number 2, and we had a pretty predictable outcome, but maybe not quite as predictable of a way of getting there. It was NS RedForce taking on the debuting, at least at this tournament, MGN Vikings, and NS are going to pick up the victory. This is not really a surprise, but I think the Vikings looked great here in their first series, all things considered. I really like this team. I thought they were underrated going into this tournament. I don't necessarily think they're unbelievable, but the LCP was a really fun watch for me when I was going and watching tape for both this tournament and for Worlds, and Vikings was one of the teams that I was like, man, I think in a different world, if they have a slightly more consistent roster, perhaps, this is actually a Worlds team that can make a bit of a difference in the way that Secret Whales kind of came together and ended up doing that in the LCP. But Nongshim just a little bit better in terms of the execution down the stretch, even if it was against their own best interest. Game number 1 was fine. Game number 2 was a disaster from a consistency standpoint for them. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Boy, are they lucky they've got the world champ diff on the top side here with Kingin coming in, obviously at the beginning of this year. He's player of the series, and he dominated this one. I was getting worried about Kingin. Like, you guys know, if you watched any of my LCK videos down the stretch of the summer split, this guy was unbelievably good at the beginning of the year, and then was not so good in the summer when everything was falling apart. Yes, the case is probably to be made that, okay, he had to play against the 4 best LCK teams over and over and over again. He was never really going to be able to pop off when the rest of his roster was getting destroyed in that instance. But even when we saw him in the play-in stage, he wasn't really that version that we saw at the beginning of the year where we were calling him a top 3, top top laner, not only in the LCK, but like probably top 5 in the world in terms of the way he was playing, some of the best individual gameplay that KIA has had throughout his entire career. I'm glad to see that at least carried over to this tournament, because game number 2 was not a win without KIA. You know, Jiwoo I think was also really good, but KIA really is the one who solidified everything on the Renekton if he wasn't able to get in there and absolutely destroy things and really win a lot of these fights, because Vikings were just a little bit disconnected. I think Nongshim probably do end up losing this series. So credit to KIA. Maybe not series, I shouldn't say that, but definitely game number 2. Credit to KIA for being able to salvage that. Jiwoo's the other player that you want to shout out. He's been good at this tournament so far. Looked very good in lane earlier on here against FearX, and that's not something you always say against Diablo. You know, he was actually able to generate a pretty consistent lead, and he was really good in this series against both Shogun and Style on the other side of this matchup. So I'm really happy for Jiwoo. At least he's actually able to prove that some of that hype that he had at the beginning of the year isn't all gone after a pretty bad 2025 for him. We have to talk about his support, though, because I'm doing the rare thing of, even in a 2-0, giving Dead of the Series to somebody on the winning side of the matchup. I just cannot justify how Lehens ended up playing out this series. He's Dead of the Series for me. I'm sorry. Like, there was nobody that frustrated me on the map more than Lehens did in this series. And I just, maybe it's personal, where it's just like I expect so much from him. I expect him to be the best player for Nongshim like he was at the beginning of the year and be that world-class kind of support, but he's just not been that. This guy is so inconsistent in the way he plays. The Nautilus was fine. He set up Jiwoo incredibly well to play that Kai'Sa game in game 1. This Blitzcrank was terrible. Like, he ended up just piloting it and playing it just about as poorly as you can. He had his Elise taken away from him in game 2, and I wonder if game 2 was just a protest to try and get a game 3 where he could actually play Shen. Genuinely one of those games where it's like, oh man, you gotta turn things around. Hopefully Lehens can figure things out, because I love this guy when he's on form. It just feels like he's not on form right now. Calyx has been good at this tournament. Gideon, I think, had a nice turnaround here in this series after the first one against BFX. Overall, Nongshim, I think, was solid enough in this series. They picked up the win. Game 1 was certainly very good. I just wish they were more consistent in that game number 2. Then for Vikings on the other side, they were fine. I think they were everything I expected them to be. They had some pluses and minuses. Topside was actually pretty good, which is not the part of the map that I expected to really be solid. Kratos and Guri, I thought, were solid enough as players to generate leads and be able to play through the mid game. And then Style was actually really good in game number 2 here on the Sivir. It's just that Kati didn't actually have the performance that Showmaker had earlier on in this tournament on the Malzahar. And this team was super disconnected in all of their team fights. Shulong, I just do not think was in a good enough spot in a lot of these positions. It really felt like they were either taking fights 3v5 while 2 other members were doing something else, especially around major objectives where they felt like they never really had a good call, or they would invest a lot of resources into fights that weren't necessarily the right call and the right timing and the right way to engage, and it just kind of put them on the back foot. Overall, Vikings feel like they are a good team. They just didn't really have everything coming together. Again, I want to give a big shout out to Gori, who I thought was actually really good in these 2 games at setting things up. Gideon has not really been all that good at this tournament so far, even if he was significantly better in this second series. Gori, I think, took advantage of that lack of early game, and I think actually was able to generate a nice gold lead for himself. Kratos, like I said, was solid in that same vein. K'Sante and Mbessa really fit into his playstyle, and I think he showcased that. If Kati and Shogun can play better, I know Style kind of came in for that game number 2 and looked way better than Shogun, but, you know, Shogun is the player that I was really excited about in the bot lane here. If those two can really step up and start playing the way that we know they can at their absolute best, Vikings are a team that I think can cause an upset here against a team like Ninjas in Pyjamas or someone like that. I'm not saying that they're going to be able to get out of the group, but I certainly don't think they're pushovers, and I think they kind of proved that in this series. But for Nongshim, they just were better. They should be better, and game 2 shouldn't have been as close as it was. It feels like there's a lot of flip-flopping at this tournament, but you know what? That makes for some pretty fun and entertaining games. The first half of the group stage, the round robin, I guess you could say, is done here, and Nongshim are in a pretty good position now, even with the loss to BFX, as long as they can beat NIP to get themselves out of this group. But now moving on to day number 3, and day 3 kicked off with one of the bigger upsets at the tournament for sure up until this point. It was JD Gaming taking on GAM Esports, and GAM is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. Some way, somehow, GAM is going to upset the world and kind of dominate JDG in this series. You know, dominate feels like a stretch in terms of how this ended up breaking down, because I don't necessarily think that, you know, GAM was always running things, but at the end of the day, when execution really became a priority in the mid game for these two teams, it was GAM who executed better, and therefore it's GAM who ends up crossing the finish line and being the better team in this series. Incredible stuff from them. JDG, what a collapse in these games. I got to cast these live. Nightmarish stuff from them in terms of their mid-game execution. They were so good at generating leads in the early game, especially in game number 1, where Scout was like 4-0 at like 7 minutes into the game on Cassio. RS was out of the game. There was no way for him to even have a chance of being able to play at all on the rise, and yet somehow, some way, it's the rise that's significantly more relevant in the back half of the game because it's just pick after pick after pick. The one thing you can't really allow to happen over to GAM in these games, and the same thing happened in game number 2. You're staring down Vi, Talia, and Lucian. And the one thing you can't really allow to happen is to get outscaled, is to get to the point where you're in a spot where you're getting, outplayed in the mid game. You have the damage, you have the Jax for side laning in the later part of the game that should be able to open up the map. There's not really anybody on GAM that should be able to answer that all that easily, and yet, even with the gold lead that you generated, you just aren't able to maintain that pressure and maintain that momentum, and they lose the series. Credit to GAM. They played awesome across these 2 games. A couple of things to really point out, I think, in terms of positives for them. Again, their mid games were excellent, but mostly that's because of Levi in the jungle. He's going to get player of the series for me here. I was really, really excited watching Levi play in summer, and I called this out on broadcast. You guys know, if you've been around the channel for a little while, that honestly, the domestic version of Levi has not necessarily lived up to his reputation over the past couple of years, in my opinion. I think he's been fine as a jungler in the PCS and the LCP when he's gotten a chance to play, and obviously his teams have found success here on GAM over the past couple of years. But when I watched those teams going into international tournaments, when I made the primers, going into, MSIs or Worlds or all that stuff, I would be like, well, Levi's not the Levi that you think he is. He's picking a lot of off-meta stuff, and he'll either make it work or he'll run it down. Like, he's just not consistent in that regard. Throw that out for the summer split. I thought this was maybe his best regular season. I get that the sample size was much smaller, but he was excellent in summer. Domestically in the LCP, it's the one year this team doesn't actually make Worlds. It's very funny how that ends up working out, but I was really impressed with what I saw. It really did feel like he adapted to Fearless well and had a couple of picks that he really relied on. I was worried that Pantheon getting nerfed and kind of getting taken out of the meta was going to hurt him quite a bit. That has not been the case, really, at all. He was excellent on the Kiana in game number 1. Truly looked like, Tien or Shun on the other side of this with how they had played it all year long. That Kiana felt very comfortable for him. He's obviously a great carry player, and the Vi was great in game 2 as well. Maybe not quite as deserving a player of the game as what he got. I think it's absolutely ridiculous that Elio did not get player of the game for game number 2. He ran that game. Every aspect of it was controlled by the Poppy, but Levi definitely deserves player of the series for his contributions as a whole. But I gotta shout out Elio because holy crap, what a game 2 on the Poppy. Arguably the best single game in this series. He was tremendous on that. And you can look at this comp and you can see, oh yeah, it's Jax, Wukong, Ahri, Kalista into Poppy. Like, of course, this champion completely shuts it down on R5. But how many times at this tournament have we already talked about a Poppy that was set up perfectly, was in a great team comp to be able to dominate, and then just could not get it done? It's not automatic. It's not immediate that this champion is just going to be able to win you the game. Elio was everywhere on the map, super active, and really just destroyed the game. So credit to him. Aris, I think, is another player I want to shout out. I really want to give I want to give a lot of props to Aris for falling down like 0-3, 0-4 at the beginning of that Rise game in game number 1, and yet still being arguably the highest damage dealer in those late game team fights, I guess, outside of Artemis on this Corki. And then the Talia was also massive. The shoves he was able to hit at the end of game number 2. This guy's actually a phenomenal team fighter. He just needs to learn how to survive in the laning phase because it actually was a problem. He was getting mega gapped by Scout in the 1v1. It's just getting to the late game that he ended up doing really well. Kia was really good. I think specifically on the Renekton in game number 1. Artemis was pumping out damage. That Corki was ridiculously high damage, and the Lucian was excellent in game number 2. He was in consideration for player of the game. GAM, I just think, looked great. This wasn't just JDG running it down. I think GAM actively played really well here today. And then for JDG on the other side, like, this is a nightmare result. This actively puts a big damper on what your expectations are, because now you're looking at a situation where you've beaten Weibo Gaming, yes, but you've ended your group stage. It's over now. You don't play on the final day. You lost again. You're 1-2 no matter what. Now they just have to hope that Dplus KIA can get the job done against Weibo Gaming, because Weibo being at 1-2, I believe, due to head-to-head, would mean that JDG would be the team to get out second from this group, sitting at 1-2, but GAM is also potentially going to be sitting at 1-2 now, so it becomes a really interesting conversation. JDG might have shot themselves in the foot, and really what they did, especially after that win that they got over Weibo, is take it out of their hands. They were basically given the ball by Weibo Gaming to determine whether or not they got out of this group, and they threw it right back. Now it's up to Weibo to win a series to see if they can get themselves into that top 2, but for JDG, like, what do you even talk about? Everything went wrong in the late game here. Pays, for me, is easily done of the series. I thought he was easily the worst player on the Rift. This guy's positioning was terrible in both of these games. The Kai'Sa was constantly getting caught in game number 1 by either a flashing crocodile or by a Ryze, which is just unacceptable. And then the Kalista was just not good enough in game number 2. I don't know why this team did not trust him to put him on a hyper carry in that second game, but it wasn't good. Paze did not look good. He did not have the impact on the map that he needed to, and he was completely outplayed by Artemis on the other side, which is unacceptable. And then, obviously people are talking about Scout. At the very least, Scout was able to win in lane and generate resources for himself, and for Shun to a lesser extent. It's just Scout was horrendous when it actually came to the team fighting, which is basically the opposite version of Scout that we had gotten all year long up until this point. The carry duo for JDG absolutely let them down in this series. A really disappointing performance from them. Zhuo was not good, completely outplayed by Elio. Xiaoshu was the only hope in game number 2 on the Jackson. Even then, like, how was he ever supposed to play this game into a Poppy? How was he ever supposed to take over in any of these team fights if they are forcing 5v5? Shun was not very good. He even stole some kills. That would have been really nice to have on some primary threats throughout this. Just was not a good series for JDG. I think they just got completely outplayed, and that's a really bad sign. Again, everything is out of their hands. This might be their last game of the entire tournament, but for GAM, they've kept themselves in this, and they've kept themselves alive. Again, I don't know the tiebreakers. I don't know how everything ends up breaking down, at the very least as of recording this right now, but what I do know is that GAM now has the possibility of getting out of this group in second place if some miracle ends up happening, and I think that that's just ridiculous. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and hopefully we can get some normality, but we all know we didn't. We got some controversy, I guess, in this second game. It was Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on Vikings Esports, and man, this was a weird one to talk about. Ninjas in Pyjamas won 2-1, but you really have to put an asterisk next to this. I almost consider just putting an asterisk next to NIP win because, I mean, what the hell happened here? I mean, if this is not a definition of a Mickey Mouse tournament at this point, I don't know what is. First off, Doingby pulling out the Pantheon mid that the last time he played in the LPL, he went like 0-16 on it and basically gave a free win to FPX and to Shadow. It was really funny to watch, but he pulls that out in game number 2 and basically gives another free win over to VKE into the Scion mid of all things. Very funny how that game ends up working out. And then, of course, the actual controversy here in game number 3, where the disconnect happens at one of the most key times in the entire game. You have an absolute nightmarish internet scenario. You have a disconnect, and NIP get to win the game off of it. This is the problem with remote tournaments, and the fact that this can happen at all, the fact that, you know, there is even the potential for this to take place already showcases just how much Riot cares about this tournament in general. But I mean, what do you even want me to say? I can break down the games that we had up until that point, but the fact that NIP won this, I'm not saying that VKE would have definitely won this series or anything like that, would have definitely won game 3, but they had the chance to win game number 3. They were certainly in that game, and then it was completely taken away from them. If this is the internet that GAM just destroyed JDG on, that's even funnier. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Niket, for me, is going to get player of the series, regardless of how you want to slice the end of this. Niket was awesome throughout this entire series, especially through their wins. I think that Renata game was absolutely clutch in game number 3. We've had a lot of really good performances from some supports over the course of this tournament already. This is definitely one of the better ones. I think he was super consistent at being able to set up the rest of his team, even if the rest of his team was not very consistent at being able to follow through on it. We'll talk about players like Leave, players like Nio, who just did not play all that well today, got completely outplayed by their opposition, but Niket was the one player that I think was actively stepping up and pushing things forward for Ninjas in Pyjamas. We still have to count on game number 1 and most of game number 3 as well, but certainly, you know, it's a weird one to talk about. I think Doingby definitely also got consideration for me for player of the series. He was the one player actually trying to be consistent. He was awesome on Rise in game number 1, completely threw away game number 2 by actively trolling and picking the Pantheon, and then got bailed out in game number 3. Anyways, if he had played a little bit better in game 2, perhaps he would have gotten that player of the series, but I just can't, under good faith, justify giving him player of the series after he pulled out a notoriously terrible Pantheon mid in game number 2 after it got nerfed. It's just a ridiculously bad draft decision, and I do blame him for it. So Doingby, you know, kind of paying the sins for that by losing out on player of the series. And then there's basically no one else to really praise here from NIP. Solo kill was okay. Nio had a couple of moments, but for sure was outplayed by Gori on the other side, who actually was really good for VKE, for Vikings in this series. And then Leave, my goodness, he is not showing up. I know his counterpart, I guess not counterpart, right? Like his spiritual counterpart over in the LCK and Diablo is having a phenomenal tournament. And I think a lot of us hoped that Leave would be able to step up and showcase that mechanical skill here, that no brain, all hands, you know, mentality that Diablo has been so successful successful on, but it's just not been there for Leave. He has not looked good in his 2 series so far at this tournament. He'll have another shot on day number 4 to potentially try and convince people this team is not out by any stretch of the imagination. This win actually keeps them in, and their matchup on the final day really matters, but Leave has not played well. I don't think Naya has played particularly well for this team. NIP have really not been all that impressive, and especially with how the LPL has been playing at this tournament so far, this was not one of those series that inspires confidence, because Vikings looked awesome in this series. There are a couple of key notes, I think, to point out. First and foremost, Style is awesome. Like, this guy needs to be playing a lot more. I really like Shogun. I think he's a really talented player, and honestly, if you would ask me coming into this tournament, who did I want to see more of, Shogun would have been my answer, because I really, I think every time I've seen him, either in the PCS or at Worlds internationally, this guy's really impressed me with his mechanics and his ability to play laning phase. Right now, Style is just on fire. This guy's lighting games up when he gets the opportunity to step in, and he looks like $1,000,000. Another player that looked phenomenal in this series was Guri in the jungle, and he looked excellent in their first matchup as well against Nongshim. This guy might just be really good. We already knew that this guy was kind of on an upward trajectory last year when we were talking about him on the channel, but boy, has it gotten even further. Like, his ability to control the game from ahead is actually terrifying. He is, like, really elite at that, and it's fun to watch. The Zyra game in game 2 was excellent from him. He did a phenomenal job of basically controlling the entire map. I do have to give a dead of the series, and unfortunately for me, it is going to go to Kati in the mid lane. I like the Scion. I think it kind of worked in game number 2. I'm kind of a fan of picks like this for the most part that can neutralize a lot of mid lane matchups and get you into that mid to late game power spike, but the Aurora in particular in game 1 was really just not good, and I think that's why he's getting dead of the series for me. I think that the other option here was Leave on the other side of this. If you want to give it to Leave, I'm not even really going to be all that frustrated with you. I do kind of understand that. The Twisted Fate, generally fine, but I feel bad for VKE, for Vikings fans, for LCP fans, because, whether or not they would have won this series without the internet problems and without everything going on, we'll never know. We'll never have an answer to that. But the fact that we even have to ask the question, or the fact that they feel like they could have or should have won a series like this, and especially with how much NIP were laughing at the end of this game, it's got to just sting, right? Like, it's got to just feel really bad. Obviously, hopefully they can, keep their heads on about them. This isn't the last time we will see them at this tournament. We will have at least one more series of them, but sitting at 0 and 2, they're not in a great spot going into the final day. NIP are going to be laughing their way to the bank, and unfortunately for Vikings, they just kind of have to deal with it. But for NIP, this keeps them alive. It makes their matchup against Nongshim really important on the final day. If they can pick up a win there, they are likely out of this group. Regardless of how you feel the LPL has performed at this tournament so far, they still very much are alive, and now it just comes down to execution. Then moving on to our third series of day number 3, and this is a big one. This could lock in quite a bit for Group A, depending on the outcome, but because it's ASI that we got the most chaotic result. It was Dplus KIA taking on Weibo Gaming, and of course Weibo Gaming are able to pick up the 2-0 win here. Of course they end up taking this series to complete the circle of suck and keep everything as wide open as it possibly can be. DK go to 1-1 with another game against GAM as their final one, so an expected 2-1 output from DK. Weibo Gaming go to 2-1 now because they beat GAM earlier on in this tournament, and now are in a spot that, despite losing to JDG, are basically locked for top 2, and JDG is now sitting at 1-2 thinking, how did we screw this up? How did we cook ourselves this badly? How did we get in the kitchen and ruin this in the way that we did? Congrats to Weibo for really putting themselves in as good of a position as possible. JDG basically handed them the keys to get themselves out of this group, and they more than took it. The rivals that were able to beat them at this tournament are the ones that they are making suffer for it. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Xiaohu, for me, is going to get player of the series. What an awesome showcase from him. This was mid domination, and let's be clear, this was domination for everybody on Weibo. Really, the only player on DK who played even remotely okay was aiming in the bot lane. Barrel was all right, but didn't really have a lot of agency in terms of the way he got to play the game. Everybody else just completely gapped their opposition. Breathe was infinitely better than Shiwu. TN completely gapped Lucid, and specifically Xiaohu mega gapped Showmaker on the other side of this, which I think is just a little bit surprising. We got Showmaker's LeBlanc in game number 1, what I would consider to be his signature champion, the one that I think he is probably the best LeBlanc of all time on. To talk what you want about, Faker's LeBlanc or, anybody else. I think Showmaker has a really strong argument for being the best LeBlanc player ever, and Xiaohu completely dismantled him on the Orianna, but it was specifically this game number 2. It was the Cassio into Ryze, which again, everybody's so obsessed with this idea that Cassiopeia is a counter to Ryze, and I feel like this just dates too far back for people to even remember why this is the case. I get that you can ground him with the miasma and that your damage in the late game is really high, so you can kind of outpace machine gun Ryze in terms of how much you're able to output, but the big problem here is that this is not the lane counter that people think it is right now. People are playing it so aggressive, and you have to make a ton of mistakes on Ryze to be able to really punish that, because Ryze still scales well, and he's got the ultimate now to be able to move around the map. If you're going to play with an aggressive jungler like Lee Sin, all of a sudden your tempo is so much higher than Cassiopeia's, and so it doesn't even really feel like a counter pick, and Xiaohu absolutely utilized that. He was excellent in this series, truly played some of the best League he's played in quite a long time. I think Xiaohu's been good throughout this year. I've been pretty vocal about that on the channel. I think he's been borderline all-pro. I'm not saying he's been a superstar. Mid lane's been relatively weak over in the LPL, and I think Xiaohu has been able to live up to that. But Showmaker has also been good and really the most important player for Dplus KIA throughout all of this year. For him to step up in a huge moment here for Weibo, super, super cool of him to do. Tien and Breathe also with some legacy-type performances. Tien completely gapped Lucid. I mean, this was a disgusting jungle difference in this one. I very much considered giving Tien player of the series because those early games were just nightmarishly bad for Dplus KIA. He basically got to do anything on the map that he wanted to, and part of that was the mid lane difference, part of that was the top lane difference, but really Tien was a reason that those two had such an easy time. Breathe was awesome here. The Rek'Sai, the Cassante, I mean, Shiwu didn't even get a single kill in this entire series. That's how nightmarish this was in a top lane perspective. Those three really carried Weibo Gaming across the line. Not to say that Light and Crisp were terrible. They were really good in this series, just that I don't necessarily think they were the main characters in the same kind of way that Breathe, Tien, and Xiaohu were. They were the ones that really pushed Weibo Gaming to a victory here, and they deserve all the credit for keeping Weibo alive and putting them in a great spot to get out of this group. And then for Dplus KIA, it's not, oh, by the way, it's not even keeping them alive. We'll get to DK. I think they're officially out at 2-1. They're guaranteed because JDG is officially ending the group at 1-2. I think Weibo Gaming have now secured a top 2 spot. Technically, DK could fall out if they lose to GAM, but you know, we'll talk about DK now. You know, Showmaker was just not good enough here today. I think that's the easy one. He's going to get out of the series. It's funny. I saw a comment from somebody online that was like, was this just a throw-off between 3 former world champion mid laners here with Scout in the first series with Doingby in the second series, and now it's Showmaker in the third series. It was kind of funny how that ended up working out. 3 world champion mid laners all just kind of not playing super well, although Doingby was definitely the best of those 3. Certainly was in the running, just maybe not on that pantheon. But Showmaker, I mean, he was awful in this series. The LeBlanc looked super far behind, didn't really have any tempo, and then the Cassiopeia just, it did not feel comfortable for him. He did not really feel like somebody who had agency on that champion, and really, you need to have agency on that champion. You need to have a jungler that can play for you, a bot lane that's pushing up, so that you can feel more comfortable playing Cassio in the late game, playing that front-to-back style. If you're not able to pump out that damage, or if the game is not going to stall out to that point, that champion just can't really achieve the goals that she wants, and I thought Showmaker played it quite terribly. But how can you not also consider Shiwu or Lucid for dead of the series here? I mean, they were also horrifically bad. Lucid got just destroyed in the jungle. I'm sorry, like this was not pretty. Tien, you know, embarrassed him. I think in terms of how this went down, he kind of had I don't want to say a rookie moment because he's not a rookie, but like this is his first like real big test this year as kind of a breakout like main character for DK. Doesn't really have a lot of other players to hide behind, and it did not go well here against Weibo in this series. Shiwu, it's his first ever international tournament, and boy, did that not look good for him against Breathe. 0, 12, and 3, I think is indicative of the gameplay here. All the top side just got mega gapped. Like, there's not really a lot to say. Only thing I will say kind of in favor of DK is that aiming tried in this series. He was at the very least aggressive, especially on the Xayah. In game number 1, it just didn't really matter. Barrel was okay on the Lulu. It was a 2v8, and there wasn't really a ton that they were going to be able to do to pull that game back, and then game 2 was even more of a stomp than game number 1 was. So, you know, for DK, this is an okay spot. Like, you're not feeling the worst you possibly can about this, but you did not want to lose this because, you know, even if you do get out of this group, you want to be the number 1 seed. You don't want to have to go in and play, you know, a team like FearX, who might be on fire right now over in Group B. You've already lost to a team like FearX multiple times throughout this split, and it's a best of 3. Anything can happen in that. Not that, you know, a team like Nongshim or Ninjas and Pyjamas are guaranteed to lose or anything like that, but rather, you don't want to be the number 2 seed. You wanted to be the team that dominated this tournament and walked out as the clear number 1 team at ASI. Well, that's been thrown entirely into question because Weibo Gaming just eviscerated them, and hopefully this is the version we actually get from them for the rest of this tournament. I get it. Like, they're super inconsistent. They don't really have a lot of, you know, plus traits traits going for them in terms of their players over the course of this year, but on any given day, this team can figure it out. The question is this going to be more of the reality that we get from Weibo, or are they immediately just going to go back to what they were before this, that inconsistent mess that they had been, that lost to JD Gaming, that, had some moments against GAM that you felt, you questioned? Like, you don't want to see that version of Weibo. This is the version of Weibo we've been waiting on, and hopefully it's finally activated in them. But then moving on to our fourth and final day of action here at ASI in the group stage, and we ended off our group stage days with some pretty, I guess, obvious outcomes, or at least the first one was pretty obvious. BFX taking on Viking Esports, and BNK FearX is going to pick up the 2-0 win. Again, no real surprise here. They end up going undefeated in their group 3-0 to get themselves that #1 spot out of group B. No shocker there. I think the moment they beat Nongshim, that was pretty locked in. I think everybody knew that they were better than Ninjas in Pyjamas, and certainly everybody expected them to be better than Viking. But at the very least, Viking was a fun team to watch at this tournament. Unfortunately, their run will also conclude here without them picking up a series win, despite what happened against Ninjas in Pyjamas. I'm sure they feel pretty hard done by that, but at the end of the day, it just wasn't meant to be. Fortunately, they got Vikla in this series, and that's never a good sign. Vikla is going to get player of the series for me, but we're going to talk just a bit about why this was much more of a team effort than it was one individual player. I do want to give credit where credit is due. I think a lot of people who watch the LCK or like generally observe the LCK don't really think of Vikla in a positive light, and honestly, I think that that has more to do with the fact that most people's perception of Vikla going into the year was his failures in the LCS, and then of course in the LPL on FlyQuest and Rare Atom. But I think those tenures are both marred by inconsistency rather than just innate failure. I think people forget that Vikla was very good in the spring split, or at the very least, like one of the better mid laners. I had him first team All-Pro in spring. I know people did not really like that. I thought mid was super weak in North America at the time. There really wasn't anybody that was performing at a good quality, but Vikla to me was a player that bare minimum was a top 2 or top 3 mid laner in North America until the summer split, where things kind of fell off track. We've talked about that FlyQuest team with other players on this channel before. It's been very clear that that team just had mental problems, that they boomed and they could never really recover in terms of the atmosphere on that team. It is what it is. I'm not entirely blaming Vikla, but he was certainly the worst player on that team. I don't think there's any real debate about that. He earned getting benched that split. And then he goes over to the LPL, and, honestly, it looks like things are going to be much better. I actually predicted a bounce back for both him and Prince when they went to the LPL last year, and while neither of them actually had a bounce back moment, both of them were, pretty bad for most of their tenure. They were bad in different ways. Prince was bad in the sense that it felt like he wasn't really trying all that much and that he was kind of mentally checked out. He was good when he got his opportunities and when he actually did lock in, but it just wasn't consistent enough. And then for Vikla, like when he looked good, he looked really good. I think people don't remember, but that team, that Rare Atom team, got top 4 in Demacia Cup, which nobody was expecting. And then obviously spring was terrible. It was kind of the opposite of North America, where he was one of the worst players, if not the worst player in the LPL in spring in 2024, and then they add Xiaohao for summer, and everything is a lot better. So I think all of this to kind of just conclude that Vikla has had a weird career. He's not been this like disaster player everywhere he's played. He's just really inconsistent, and while again he was terrible for winter and for spring this year because he just can't seem to figure it out for at least one half of the year, he was better in summer, and he still had his bad games. He still has some up and down performances, but he certainly is playing better now than he has at any other point in the year. And this should not be all that surprising that he's better than a player like Kati on the other side, who's good, but certainly not great. Vikla is not a great player, but he's certainly not a terrible player either. And I think that was the whole point of me kind of bringing everybody through the history lesson of how things ended up breaking down there. But, for as much as we can talk about BFX, I mean, player of the group stage, which we're not doing, but player of the group stage was absolutely Diablo. I mean, this guy looked absolutely like the hype. Like, he lived up to the hype here. There is no doubt about that in terms of how things broke down. He was everything he was advertised to be, and then some. That Misfortune game in Game 2 was disgustingly good, and I know people hate that champion, and so people are probably mauling right now that he looked so good getting to play that champ so aggressive, but the carry duo stepped up here today. Vikla was exceptionally good on the Orianna and the Ryze, and then Diablo mostly on the Misfortune, but still a pretty good Jhin game. Raptor, I thought, had his best series of the group stage by far. Guri has been one of the better players here for Viking over the course of this group stage, and Raptor, I think, finally showed up and showcased what I had been hyping him up for throughout a lot of the LCK split. Kellen and Clear were also solid. Clear got put more on weak side, but definitely was better than Kratos on the other side of this, which we will talk about. BFX, I think, earned that #1 seed, earned that undefeated record, and then for Viking on the other side, it's just really tough to kind of talk about this team's performance because I think they were kind of thrown to the wolves a little bit, literally, or I guess thrown to the foxes here on their final series, where the one series that they actually had a chance to win, which was against Ninjas and Pyjamas, they actually didn't have a chance to win because their internet gave out. And so it's really hard to kind of analyze them in terms of what they are. I like this Vikings team a lot. I talked about that going into the tournament. I think they're better than GAM. And I know that's not the hottest take in the entire universe, but they're a really fun team. I think they have some really fun young players. Guri is a player I'm really going to be interested in. Both Shogun and Style, I think, are good AD carries, and I think we saw that over the course of this tournament. It's just not a complete package for them, and that's kind of the thing that ended up bringing them down. Kati, I don't think, had a great tournament in terms of how things broke down. Shuilong, I don't also think was very good down in the support position. Do I think he was a disaster? No. I think that there were probably worse supports at this tournament, but I certainly don't think he was like a superstar or anything like that. And then Kratos is just, he's fine as a top laner. He's going to get out of the series here. It didn't really feel like he was good enough to be competing at a tournament of this caliber. That's going to happen in the LCP. All due respect to the LCP talent pool. Like, to be the 4th or 5th best team in the LCP means you probably have a glaring weakness somewhere. Like, the super consistent teams are likely going to Worlds, and so the ones that have pretty exploitable lanes end up, you know, at tournaments like this, and Kratos just kind of felt like one of those. But again, mid lane also felt like a bit of a gap in favor of every team that ended up going into Viking, and Kati is a player that has international experience from previous years, so it just kind of is what it is with Viking. I don't think anybody is surprised that they went 0-3, but certainly not the worst showing you can give for an LCP team. And again, for FearX, the expectation was for them to get out of this group as the #1 seed with how they had played in the regular season and how they had beaten Nongshim in the play-ins, and they did just that. They are going to be the only undefeated team coming out of the group stage, and therefore kind of the favorites right now to take the entire tournament. Really intrigued to see if they can live up to that, because, you know, this roster on paper might not look like world beaters, but they certainly play better than expectation right now. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and we've only got deciders here on day 4 as we have the final Group A matchup between Dplus KIA and GAM Esports, where Dplus KIA are going to pick up the 2-0. No miracle is going to happen here today. If GAM had won this, they would be moving on to the next round, to the top 4 at this tournament, which would have been absolutely ridiculous, but unfortunately the clock kind of struck midnight for them in this series, where DK just kind of are better in basically every single way. GAM go out with a fight, you know, pulling out the Shyvana Galio in game number 2 to really just say, hey, that wasn't a fluke on day number 1. We truly do believe that this is something we can win with. This is one of Levi's, you know, signature picks alongside the Nocturne that you've always associated with him. Unfortunately, it did not work at this tournament. It really ended up being a bane rather than a boon for GAM. And for DK, you stave off disaster here with that loss that you had to Weibo Gaming. You go 2-1, and you get yourself out of this group alongside Weibo to move on to the top 4 to close out Group A. Obviously, this is expected from Dplus KIA. They were the highest seed coming in from the LCK at this tournament. Certainly the one with the highest expectations, even if FearX from a performance standpoint was remarkably similar, if not even slightly better to DK in everything outside of their one playoff series that they played against each other. DK definitely was the team that, from a notoriety perspective, from a team building perspective, and just generally from a vibes perspective, was the favorite at this tournament to take it all, and they are finally, at the very least in this series, living up to some of that hype. Let's talk about it. Showmaker, for me, is going to get player of the series. I think this is really up for debate. Everybody on DK did well. You know, I think you have to take out both of the bot lane members. Aiming and Beryl weren't necessarily the heroes for the team here. Not that they were terrible. Beryl was actually pretty good here. Aiming was almost entirely inconsequential towards whether or not this team won this series or not, but Shiwu, Lucid, and Showmaker, I think, all have a pretty strong argument for being player of the series. Showmaker and Lucid because of their consistency across both of the games. That's why I ended up leaning towards Showmaker as well. He was really good on the Zoe in game 2. He was excellent on the Orianna in game number 1, and I think he was probably the best across both games combined. Lucid because he was the one to kind of facilitate everything, even if he wasn't always the main character in either game. I don't know if I necessarily would give him player of the game for either, but Shiwu was absolutely the player of the game for game number 2 on the Jax. Unfortunately, I just think the Mbessa game was a little bit too weak in game number 1 for me to give him player of the series. You know, whatever you want to go with, whoever you want to give this to, DK deserves to be praised for how they ended up winning this. They brought out some signature picks of their own here. The Shyvana obviously on the other side in game number 2, but Showmaker Zoe in that second game alongside a Lee Sin. A very dangerous combo if you can pull it off, and Showmaker obviously is more than good enough. It's one of his best champions alongside that LeBlanc that I kind of associate with Showmaker over the course of his career. And then we already talked about it, but Shiwu being able to step up and honestly just being better than KIA in this series was massive. I honestly don't know if I would have expected that on paper going into this, not because I think Shiwu is a bad player. I'm one of the biggest Shiwu defenders in the entire world in terms of what his actual, skill level is at right now. I think he's an unbelievably good team fighter. He just needs to figure out how to lane, but that's the thing, right? KIA is an excellent laner, and I figured he was going to be able to, at the very least, generate some advantages, but playing things like Rumble and Yorick in these two matchups and kind of getting taken out of the game, like, that's all in favor of Shiwu, specifically in that game number 2, which was a Jack's paradise. I mean, that was a brilliant game from him. The KDA is never going to reflect how relevant and how important he was towards that win in game 2, but everything kind of looking much better for DK coming off of that loss to Weibo Gaming. They needed a result like this, and they very much got it. And for GAM on the other side, it's unfortunate that this is the way that their tournament ends, but just like I said for Viking, I think they're going to be happy with the performance they gave, maybe even more so for them because they were able to pick up a 2-0 win over an LPL team, which is already such a feather in the cap of the LCP. That's got to feel so good, especially with a team like the Flying Oysters doing so well internationally across the beginning of this year. But I think that there were some problems, and I think there are some things to point out as to why GAM was considered a pretty big underdog at a tournament like this. Levi, while he played well domestically, kind of showed some of the pitfalls that he falls into during Fearless. He was not playing Shyvana and Lilia and all of those things domestically. His two most played champions were Pantheon and Wukong, and obviously those are super good champions. They're very meta, and Pantheon not so much anymore because of the nerfs, but, he was somebody that was very willing to play these early skirmishers, and then at this tournament, he just decided, okay, now it's time for me to scale. It's time for me to turn off all of the things that kind of got us a lot of pressure in the early game, and that made me such a dangerous early game jungler, and just go back to the Shyvana, and I think it made him worse. As a player, I get that they're kind of his comfort picks, kind of his pocket picks, if you will, but I absolutely think he played worse on the champions that did not really have agency in the mid game. When you look at the series that they won, what is the big difference? Levi was on champions that actually could go out there and just be really aggressive, like the Qiyana and like the Wukong, that have the opportunity to, be more in your face with how they play the game. I think that was always going to be more in favor of Levi rather than the Shyvana, at least in the current meta. I think that champion also was already incredibly weak. I just think it was a bad draft move, and I think it really ended up sinking them. Not that they would have won this game without it, just, something to kind of point out there. And then the rest of the team, I think, had their own pluses and minuses. RS was actually fine this tournament. I was impressed with him. I think he's definitely better than Emo. I don't know what this team's going to look like going into next year, but if he is kind of their replacement going into 2026, I think you can build around, that kind of a mid laner. Artemis is still a terrible positioner. He just has no idea where he's supposed to be on the map, but at the end of the day, he's okay in team fights, and his team never plays for him, and I think that and in and of itself is, a bit of a boon for the team overall. It's a bit of an advantage because you don't necessarily have to play for him. I wish they played for him a bit more because he had a lot of gold in game 2 and they just left him completely alone. Elio is a very fun playmaker and he's really good at finding creative angles. The problem is that he's not good at all at playing from behind. He's constantly going to go in and kill himself. And then KIA just had a really bad tournament. Honestly, I'm worried that KIA is on the downswing in terms of where he's at career arc wise. I hope that's not the case because he's been so good, the best player in the VCS and even the PCS last year for so long. He's really been like the guy to come out of that region for me in terms of mechanical skill. I always said that it was a real big shame that no LCS, LTA, or LEC team ever went out and picked him up. I really do think he was that kind of caliber. He could probably come in similar to what Broken Blade did coming in from Turkey at the time and just become one of the better, top laners in the region that he ended up coming into. I don't know if we're ever going to get that opportunity. It does really feel like KIA's kind of past the point where he's one of those world-class top laners, but still one of my favorite players of all time. Really hard to, argue too much with him, but unfortunately for GAM, this is the end of the road, and for DK, they will be moving on. We'll talk about them a bit more at the end of the video and preview their matchup, but it doesn't really get easier depending on the outcome of the next series and just how things go. In fact, I don't even think it matters. I think we already know who their matchup is, and they've had a lot of struggles with FearX already over the course of this year. Things are not guaranteed for DK to be able to walk out and win this tournament, but hard to not look at them as at the very least one of the top-tier favorites for the rest of this. But that's going to bring us to our third and final series of day number 4 and our final series of the group stage here at ASI. And this is a big one. This is for that final spot in the top 4. Winner gets there, loser is done for the year. It was Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on NS RedForce. And NS RedForce, the LCK representative, is going to pick up the 2-0 win, and they are going to punch their ticket as the 4th and final team to qualify for the top 4 for the bracket stage of this tournament. And unfortunately, Ninjas in Pyjamas with this loss will be out. Honestly, I hate to be the guy because I cast for LPL English, and, you know, I support the LPL generally speaking. I support all the regions because I cover them, and, you know, I try to stay unbiased on this channel, but NIP deserved to lose this. Like, after what happened against Vikings, there was no way it would have felt justified for them to go on to top 4. I think this is the only just outcome, is that both of them end up dropping here in the group stage, and NS is the team that ends up moving on. If there's anything to learn, it's that the LCK, not a top-heavy region in terms of how things break down. It is, as it turns out, the 5th, 6th, and 7th best teams from Korea are better than the 5th, 6th, and 7th best teams from China. It just kind of is the way that it is right now. The LCK has proven that they are the dominant region globally with a tournament like this, for as much as you want to read into it. I know some people are still pretty, you know, questioning just how much, especially the LPL teams, took this seriously, because they have been the most vocal about how they're not taking it seriously, but you know, it's something. At least they showed up and played these solo queue games better than NIP or than a lot of these other teams. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is obvious. I mean, it's Jiwoo. This guy popped off here. And honestly, can I say that he was the second best AD carry at this tournament, like in this group stage? Is that a crazy thing for me to say, that he was better than Pays, that he was better than Aiming, that he was better than Light? Like, he was better than anybody in Group A. The only AD carry he wasn't better than was Diablo, and nobody was better than Diablo in the group stage. He was incredible, but Jiwoo was awesome throughout this entire group stage. Where's this guy been throughout all of this year? We've been waiting for this version of Jiwoo to come back out after 2024 because it just hasn't been there. It seems like he regressed so much in 2025 in terms of the performances that he was giving, but this was an awesome showcase that at the very least that potential is still very much available if he can bring it out more frequently. We're going to talk about a player like Leave on the other side of this, but Leave did not have a good ASI. I thought he really underperformed, played bad in all 3 series, and, you know, I think there's a lot to talk about when it comes to that, you know, whole package. But Jiwoo actually really stepped up, a player I didn't really, you know, believe in all that much going into this tournament, who I thought was the weak link, quite frankly, for NS. You know, I think is one of the better players they have right now in terms of the form that he's in. But the one player that I think played the best for NS throughout this entire, I guess, group stage, you know, main stage, whatever you want to call it, was KeLux in the mid lane. I mean, he's really cementing himself as somebody who deserves to be starting next year in the LCK. Not that he hadn't earned that in the regular season, in my opinion. When you're talking about NS getting blasted over and over again in the Legend group in the regular season, basically the only saving grace for them was the fact that KeLux actually was playing pretty well against some of the best mid laners in the world. You know, regularly, he wasn't actively losing all that hard like everybody else was in all of their lane matchups. But yeah, I'm glad to see that carried over. I mean, he had to play some tough competition in this group. Of course, we already talked about, you know, Vikla, who is obviously not the best player in the world, but certainly not a pushover in the way that, you know, maybe some other players are. And then world champion Doingby, who is the best player on Ninjas in Pyjamas. KeLux was way better than him in this series, especially in that game number 2 on the Orianna. So credit to KeLux. I thought he played really well throughout this group stage. Gideon seems to have figured out some of his flaws. You know, Nio, I think, also had a pretty bad tournament, all things considered. Kingen, you know, was solid on day 2, or the second series that this team played, I should say, and then maybe not so much in this one. He was okay here, just much more weak side, and then Lehen's probably played his best here. He kind of sold some of the previous series that NS had played, but you have to take that feast or famine playstyle. That's what Lehen's just ends up offering you. So NS earning their spot in top 4 and earning their spot as one of the better teams at this tournament. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, Leave for me is dud of the series. I don't even think I really have to think about this all that much. You can say like, oh, well, at least he was generating resources. I know he was playing aggressive, but most of the time he was flipping those resources. This dude has no brain. Like, I can't deal with it anymore. It's really hard to watch Leave play the game. I don't want to sit here and try and compare him to other AD carries that have either succeeded or failed over the course of his career. If this guy does not figure out how to function at a professional League of Legends level in terms of his positioning, his map rotations, like the general macro part of the game, the mental part of the game, if he doesn't figure that out, he cannot be a top-tier professional player. I'm sorry, it does not matter how good your hands are. You cannot get yourself out a bad situation over and over and over and over again. You just can't do it, and I'm just tired of watching this guy make the same mistakes over and over again and get punished for them every time and never learn. So he's done of the series. I think he was bad at this tournament. I think he showed no signs of improvement, no signs of like, oh, a shining light that maybe he can bring into 2026. I think this year has lowered his stock for me, despite how good his individual performances have been at times, because I think we've just learned at this point that the inconsistency, that will never go away. That is who Leave is, and that negative version of him is just going to be what you have to deal with when you try to go to Worlds or try to compete internationally with a player like Leave. And then For the rest of this team, while they were also inconsistent, I think most of that had to do with the fact that either they're much, less experienced than someone like Leave in Nio's case and not really having a ton of opportunity to play at a level like this, or they were better. Like players like Doingby and Niket, I think had many more positive plays. Solo kill was generally, irrelevant, we'll just say, throughout this entire tournament, but Ninjas and Pyjamas basically performed to expectation. I didn't think they were better than either FearX or Nongshim. I didn't think they were going to be able to get out of this group. They end up beating Viking, but they probably shouldn't have. There was a real world at this tournament where this team does not win a single series, and if that's the case, the LPL is in dire straits. At the very least, they were able to miraculously pick up that win against Viking and, go out in peace against Nongshim, but Nongshim being the third Korean team to enter that top 4 certainly kind of supplies the narrative that the LCK is just running this tournament. We'll see if that can play throughout the rest of this tournament as we get into the later best of 3s and then eventually the finals, the best of 5, but, Nongshim more than earning their spot there. All right, but that is going to do it for my ASI group stage overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated bracket, and I guess really the only real bracket here of ASI, as we know our 4 teams to come out of the group stage. Of course, Weibo Gaming and Dplus KIA coming out of Group A, and then BNK FearX and Nongshim RedForce coming out of Group B, meeting each other here in this double elimination bracket. As a reminder, the way that this is going to break down, everything is best of 3 up until the finals. That's why, this tournament's not being considered as serious as everything else, is because best of 3s just aren't a great way to determine who actually is better in League of Legends. Best of 5s are much more accurate in terms of determining things. At the very least, we do get double elimination starting now, so if you do lose one series, at the very least, you have a lifeline, but it's 1 versus 2 in every single group, which means we get to preview some matchups. Now, 3 of these will be taking place tonight, and I want to make this announcement now instead of later on. I will be casting tonight as this video goes live, basically. This video is going live about 30 minutes before the start of the first series. I will be taking the second and third series of tonight's cast, which means I will be casting BNK FearX and Dplus KIA, as well as the winners finals, to see who ends up getting into the grand finals of this tournament tonight. As you are watching this for LPL English, you can find the links to that in the description. You can see the YouTube, the Twitch, all of that. Go follow, subscribe, come say hi in chat if you do get to watch this video live. If you don't get to watch this video live, go ahead and check out the VOD, check out the cast. You can see my thoughts live before the video even gets posted. But now I get to give my preview for these 2 series and kind of talk about what I think is going to happen moving forward, starting with the first matchup, Weibo Gaming taking on Nongshim RedForce. To me, this is the most important matchup of the tournament because this determines whether or not the LPL is even credible throughout the rest of this, or if this is just going to be an LCK top 3 that we all just kind of have to sit there and deal with. Not that I hate the LCK or anything, just, I would rather see international play than just another, LCK domestic tournament. I think we can all kind of agree on that. So I think we're all kind of hoping that Weibo can pick up the win and at least make things interesting for now. Do I believe that they're going to do that? No, I really don't. I don't really trust Nongshim. I think these are the 2 weakest teams left in the tournament. We'll talk about BFX and DK later. I think they are the 2 best teams in the tournament, likely to meet in the finals, but right now, I think Nongshim is just a little bit better. If Jiwoo is actually going to be playing at a high level, I think he'll be better than Light in this series, and I think Calyx might even be better than Xiaohu in his current state. And I think with those 2 carries, I expect Nongshim to be relevant, but I don't think this is a blowout. I think Weibo is really good at these, later tournament series, and if they ended up winning it 2-1, I mean, it's a best of 3. Anybody can win it. So I'm predicting Nongshim 2-1, but again, it can really go either way. And then the real matchup that I think is going to be interesting, BFX taking on Dplus KIA. For me, I'm actually going to go against the grain. I really do think that BNK FearX is still better than DK. I know DK ended up beating them in the playoffs, and I predicted that. That was the call I made on the channel as well. But for now, I think now that DK knows they're out of Worlds and that they don't have a ton to play for, I think the Foxes really want to win a tournament, an international tournament. It feels like they're locked in and ready to play. I think Diablo's on a complete warpath right now, and I think this team is good enough to be able to get over DK. I hope this goes all 3. For now, I'm going to predict BFX 2-1. Maybe it's a 2-0. I honestly think the Foxes are going to be able to step up here, and I think whoever wins this matchup between BFX and DK beat either of Weibo or Nongshim in the winners finals. But let me know if you agree or disagree with that takedown in the comment section below. Very curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be covering the rest of this tournament. We're going to be doing basically everything up until the finals, and then the finals will get their own separate video where we break everything down game by game. You guys know the format on this channel by now, but you really want to stick around this time of the year because in just a couple of days, Worlds coverage is going to be coming out as well. We're going to be doing my top 20 players at the World Championships list with a couple of honorable mentions, basically top 25, but really the top 20 players, and then my big Worlds primer where I preview and rank every single team, every single player at the World Championships. If you want that coverage, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.